Hi, in this video, we are going to be discussing about the connection of our topics for grade 10, which is DNA replication and protein synthesis, into what we have learned already from grade 8 and 7, which are genetics, genes, traits, dominant, recessive, and those things. Okay, so first of all, to do this, let me remind you that you can have traits that can be inherited. For example, you have certain facial features that you kind of inherit from your father, or maybe your height, you're tall because your father is tall, so these traits are inherited. And the thing is, how is that traits inherited from one generation to the other generation? So, well, that is because in our bodies we have what we call DNA, which is deoxyribonucleic acid, and this DNA kind of stores the information inside. So whether you become tall or not, whether you have this facial feature or not, these tendencies or not, you have allergies to something or not, that is all encoded in your DNA. And but how is the DNA kind of expressed into physical traits that we can see, like height and so on and so forth? So the bridge here is the proteins in your body. So you see, this DNA is actually set of instructions to create proteins. And these proteins affect your physical characteristics and traits. Okay? So, for example, you could have a protein, this is just an example, like tyrosinase. So, tyrosinase is a protein, and that protein is actually important in, for example, the control of melanin production. And so, when you say melanin production, it could range from color of the skin to color of your pigments in your iris or your hair. So, therefore, this protein tyrosinase kind of affects either eye color or skin color or um, the color of your hair, right? So the idea here is these traits that you have, like whether you are tall, whether you tolerate coffee better than other people, those are encoded in DNA, and those DNA actually create proteins, and those proteins affect your traits. Okay, so you might have heard of two types of melanin, eumelanin and pheomelanin. And those two types of melanin dictate whether you have red hair or blonde hair or black hair. And again, those types of pigments are controlled by proteins such as tyrosinase and other stuff. It's not just tyrosinase, it's also other stuff. But the point is, the bridge between the physical traits that we see and how how it's stored in the DNA is the proteins. What is stored in the DNA is the instructions for how to create proteins, and the proteins affect the traits that you have in your body. So this is why we can discuss the topic of protein synthesis, because if you think about it, the DNA, in order for what is stored in the DNA to be ultimately translated into traits, such as maybe you have fair skin or dark skin, that is essentially because the DNA is converted into or read and is converted, or the instructions are read to create proteins, and those proteins then affects the traits. Okay, so that is why we have protein synthesis. Okay, now another example is, let me remind you to our topic in the endocrine system. So for example, in the pancreas, if you are a pancreatic cell, obviously the job of the pancreas is to create insulin. But guess what is insulin? Insulin insulin or insulin is a protein. So if the pancreas creates proteins, what part of the pancreas creates proteins? Well, it's the cells of the pancreas. So the point is, cells in the body has to have the capability to create proteins, because those proteins are the ones that you, for example, use to create hormones, some neurotransmitters, even some structural components of your skin, like elastin, collagen, keratin in your fingernails, and those stuff. So there are a lot of proteins that are used in your body, and there are even proteins that are used in the cells themselves. So the point is, cells has to have the capability to produce proteins, and the instructions for how to create those proteins are inside the DNA. Okay, so this is how you connect, for example, character traits to our current topic of DNA, and this is how you kind of connect what does the protein synthesis have to do with the endocrine system, for example. Well, all of the hormones, all of the functional things that cells do, that cells produce, are based off of production of proteins, and even those that are not proteins are still made by mechanisms that involves a lot of proteins. Okay, so as I said, protein synthesis is inside the cell, and protein synthesis is based on the instructions in the DNA, and the DNA is inside the cell. But again, you know from grade 8 also that a cell divides, right, into two cells if you talk about mitosis. So one diploid cell divides to two diploid daughter cells, or one diploid cell divides twice, meiosis 1 and meiosis 2, into four haploid cells. But the point is they divide. The idea is, if you have DNA in the first cell, you cannot just divide the DNA into two equal parts. And so if this is one whole DNA, you can't just get half of the DNA here and half of the DNA there, right? So the idea is you have to make two copies of the DNA first, so that when you have two copies of the DNA, now when you divide, one copy goes to this cell and the other copy goes to that cell, right? Because it's kind of like dividing the properties of a house. If you have a house and you divide the house, if you have only one kitchen, then one half of that division will have no kitchen, and how would the household survive? So kind of like that. So if this parent cell has a DNA, it needs to duplicate it first into two copies before it can divide. So therefore, that's why we also discuss DNA replication, because the process at which the DNA is duplicated or replicated is through DNA replication. And why is that important? Because again, all of the traits that are, a reflection of the proteins in your body are stored in the DNA. So therefore, you need to kind of copy that instructions into another set, so that when you divide a cell, each cell would have a separate copy, right? So that is why we have these two. Now, take note that these are kind of two separate processes, because DNA replication is really, you are duplicating the instructions, right? Think of it as an encyclopedia, right? You have an encyclopedia, and the encyclopedia contains all the instructions for all the proteins that are needed in your body. DNA replication means you are duplicating the encyclopedia. So you have one set of encyclopedia, you want to make it two sets, because when you are dividing the cell, and when you divide the cell, the daughter cell number 1 must have one set of encyclopedia, and daughter cell number 2 must have one set of encyclopedia. So before division, you must have two sets of encyclopedias. So you must replicate the DNA. That's the idea for the DNA replication. Protein synthesis is not really like that. So protein synthesis is really, you are reading into the encyclopedia, and you are following the instructions in the encyclopedia to make a protein. So notice the difference. This is just copying the instructions. You're not implementing the instructions. You're not creating proteins from the instructions. You're just photocopying, so to speak, the encyclopedia, so that you have two sets of copies. Protein synthesis is different. You're not photocopying. You are reading the particular pages. You are following the instructions. You are creating proteins. So I want to emphasize this. Replication's goal is just to make two copies. It's not to read the instructions, to make two copies of the instructions, but not to follow the instructions and make proteins. Protein synthesis is really, you are reading the instructions, because the hope is from the instructions in the DNA, you can produce a protein. That's why it's called protein synthesis. You are synthesizing a protein based on the instructions from the DNA. They are similar, of course, because they use the DNA. For protein synthesis to proceed, you have to read the instructions from the DNA. For DNA replication, you have to duplicate the DNA. So they are similar, but mind you, they have different goals. The goal of DNA replication is to make two copies, so that before the cell divides, each daughter cell would have a set of instructions. Protein synthesis is not. It's not about duplicating the DNA. It's using the DNA, but it's using it to read the instructions inside the DNA and produce protein. So I hope this gives you kind of a story. Again, I'm using analogies, and sometimes analogies fail at some point. But I believe that creating stories or analogies like this actually makes it easier to understand. So replication, you're making two copies because you will be dividing the cell, and each daughter cell must have a single copy. Protein synthesis, you're not doing that. You are just simply reading the book, the encyclopedia, so that you can follow the instructions so that you can create proteins. So when you create insulin, you are doing protein synthesis. But when you are, duplicating, making two copies of the DNA so that you can divide the cell, that is DNA replication. So I hope that is clear. DNA replication is different from protein synthesis. Both of them use the DNA, but they have two different goals essentially.